Do you think life is fair to everyone? Sometimes, the tables turn in ways you can never imagine. Once upon a time, in the bustling city of Lagos, there lived a man named Richard. Richard was wealthy, successful, and well-known, but there was one thing that defined him more than his riches: his pride. He looked down on the poor and those he considered beneath him. At 38 years old, Richard owned some of the largest businesses in the city. His skyscrapers stretched high into the Lagos skyline, and his cars, shiny, expensive machines, roared through the streets wherever he went. He believed that wealth was everything, and those who didn't have it were just lazy and undeserving. One Monday morning, Richard left his luxurious mansion to attend an important business meeting. The sun shone brightly, and the streets buzzed with their usual chaos: vendors shouting, cars honking, and buses packed to the brim. Richard sat in the back of his air-conditioned black SUV, sipping his imported coffee, staring out of the window at the people outside. "Look at these people," Richard muttered to his driver, Tony. "Hustling every day like rats. Can't they do something meaningful with their lives?" Tony, a man who was kind but kept to himself, said nothing. He knew better than to argue with Richard. Suddenly, as the car approached a crowded junction, it came to an abrupt stop. There was a beggar blocking the way. The woman was old, with torn clothes and frail hands, holding out a small tin cup as she begged for spare change. Richard's brows furrowed. He hated delays. He hated beggars even more. "Why are we stopping?" he barked. "Sir, the woman is blocking the road," Tony replied softly. Richard looked out and saw the beggar. She looked pitiful, her back hunched, her grey hair tied in a rough scarf. Something about her face tugged at Richard's memory, but he brushed the thought aside. "This nonsense has to stop," he yelled. "Open the door." Tony hesitated. "Sir, I said, open the door," Richard snapped. With a sigh, Tony unlocked the car. Richard stepped out in his polished suit, his shoes gleaming like mirrors under the sun. The crowd at the junction turned their heads to watch. Richard was not an ordinary man. People knew him by his reputation. The old woman looked up as Richard marched toward her. Her hand trembled as she held out her cup. "Please, sir, just a little help," she pleaded softly, her voice breaking. Richard's face hardened. "Do you think this is a place for you to sit and beg? You're blocking the road." "I'm sorry, sir. I have nowhere else to." "Get out of my way," Richard roared, swiping her cup aside. It clattered to the ground, spilling the few coins she had collected. The crowd gasped in shock. The woman's eyes filled with tears as she bent down to pick up the coins. Her hands shook as she scrambled to gather them. "You people are so lazy," Richard said coldly. "Instead of working hard, you sit here and beg. You disgust me." "Sir, please," she murmured. Richard didn't listen. His anger boiled over. He grabbed the small plastic stool she was sitting on and tossed it aside. The crowd murmured loudly now, some people glaring at Richard, others shaking their heads. "Move," Richard barked. The woman didn't say another word. She picked up her coins and slowly limped out of the way. Richard turned on his heel, dusted off his suit like he'd been touched by dirt, and walked back to his car. As he climbed in, Tony looked at him through the rearview mirror. "Sir, that was harsh." "Drive," Richard snapped, ignoring the comment. The car roared to life and pulled away, leaving the crowd behind. But as the SUV sped through the city, Richard felt an unfamiliar weight in his chest. He shrugged it off. She deserved it, he muttered to himself. People like that are a stain on society. That evening, Richard attended a high-class event at a luxury hotel. Men in sharp suits and women in expensive gowns laughed and drank expensive wine as a jazz band played softly in the background. Richard was in his element here. He felt untouchable. As he sipped his drink, his close friend and business partner, Chike, approached him. "Richard," Chike said with a grin, "you seem tense tonight. What's wrong?" "Nothing," Richard replied quickly. "Business is good. I'm fine." Chike smirked. "You don't look fine. Come on, man, loosen up. We're on top of the world." Richard forced a smile, but his mind kept drifting back to the old woman. Her trembling hands. Her eyes. The sadness on her face. Suddenly, a waiter appeared, holding a tray. "Sir, this is for you." Richard frowned. "From who?" The waiter pointed to the back of the room, where an elderly woman in a scarf sat quietly, looking at him. Richard's heart skipped a beat. "What?" He stood up abruptly, knocking over his glass. The room went silent as everyone turned to look at him. Richard blinked, trying to steady himself. When he looked again, the woman was gone. "What's happening to me?" he muttered. Chike placed a hand on his shoulder. "Richard, are you okay?" "I need air," Richard said, pushing his way through the crowd and out into the cool night. The streets were quiet now. Richard leaned against his car, breathing heavily. His hands trembled. "This is nothing," he whispered to himself. "Just my imagination." But deep down, he knew something was wrong. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the old woman's face. Her trembling hands. The spilled coins. And the weight in his chest grew heavier. The following morning, Richard woke up feeling restless. His heart felt uneasy, as though something terrible was about to happen. He tried to ignore it and focus on his work. As he reviewed business documents in his office, his secretary, Mary, knocked and entered. "Sir, there's a visitor here to see you," Mary said. "I'm not expecting anyone," Richard replied, without looking up. "She says it's important." "Fine. Send them in." A moment later, Richard heard the soft shuffle of feet. He looked up and froze. Standing before him was the old woman. She looked even frailer than before, but her eyes held something that made Richard's heart skip, a strange familiarity. "What are you doing here?" Richard demanded, standing up. "Sit down, Richard," the woman said softly. Richard's legs wobbled, but he didn't sit. "How do you know my name?" The woman's lips trembled into a faint smile. "Because I know you, my son." Richard felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. "What did you just say?" "I said, I know you. And you are my son." Richard stumbled back, his heart pounding. "That's impossible." "Do you remember me now, Richard?" the woman asked, her voice calm but firm. "Do you remember where you came from?" Images flashed through Richard's mind, images of his childhood in a small village. A young boy running barefoot. A mother singing softly to him. A mother with the same eyes as the woman before him now. "No!" Richard shouted. "You're lying. My mother is dead." The woman sighed deeply. Do you want to know the truth, Richard? Then listen carefully. Richard stared at the old woman, his heart pounding in his chest. Her words echoed in his mind. I'm your mother. No, Richard whispered. You're lying. My mother died years ago. The old woman sighed deeply, her frail figure unmoving. I am not lying, Richard. Sit down, and let me explain. Richard felt dizzy, as though the ground beneath him had shifted. He sank into his chair, staring at the woman as though she were a ghost. How do you know my name? He asked, his voice low and trembling. The woman gave a sad smile. Because I named you. You were my little boy, my Richard. Richard's throat tightened. The images that had flashed in his mind earlier returned, faint memories of a small hut in a village, the smell of firewood, the sound of a woman's soft humming. He had buried those memories long ago. No, Richard said again, his voice growing harsher. My mother died when I was a child. She left me. The woman's eyes glistened with tears. I never left you, my son. I would never have abandoned you. Then where were you all my life? Richard demanded, his anger bubbling to the surface. If you're really my mother, where have you been? The woman clasped her hands together on her lap and took a deep breath before speaking. It's a long story, Richard. One that you need to hear, whether you like it or not. Richard clenched his fist but said nothing. He could feel his walls crumbling. Something inside him wanted answers. The woman began her tale. Many years ago, we lived in a small village far from this city. Your father and I were poor, but we were happy. You were our joy, our only child. Your father worked on farms, while I sold small items at the market. Life was hard, but we had each other. Richard's mind tugged at the memories. He could almost see it, the dusty paths, the small huts, and his parents' faces, though blurry. One day, the woman continued, your father fell ill. There was no money for medicine, and the illness took him from us. I was left alone with you, Richard. You were just a little boy. She paused, tears spilling down her cheeks. Richard's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. I did everything I could to provide for you, she said softly. I worked day and night. I carried heavy goods to the market. I begged for food when we had nothing to eat. But life was cruel. She wiped her tears with her scarf. One evening, when you were just 6 years old, a rich merchant came to the village. He told me he could take you to the city, where you would be educated and live a better life. I didn't want to let you go, but he promised me you would be taken care of. I believed him. I thought I was giving you a chance at a future that I could never give you. Richard's eyes widened. His heart thudded painfully in his chest. You mean? I wasn't abandoned, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman shook her head. No, my son. I gave you up, thinking you would have a better life. But that man, he lied to me. He sold you into the city as a servant. By the time I discovered the truth, you were gone. I searched for you for years, Richard. I went from town to town, asking anyone who would listen. But I never found you. Richard's chest felt heavy, as though a boulder had been placed on it. The truth hit him like a wave. He had always believed his mother had abandoned him out of selfishness, but now he realized the sacrifice she had made. You searched for me? Richard asked, his voice cracking. Yes, the woman said. For years. I slept on streets. I begged for food. I never stopped looking for you, even when my body grew weak. I prayed every day that God would reunite us. She looked directly into Richard's eyes, and for the first time, he saw the truth there. The woman sitting before him wasn't lying. She was his mother. Richard's hands shook as he buried his face in them. His mind spun, replaying the scene from the previous day, him screaming at the woman, tossing her belongings, and humiliating her in front of the crowd. I didn't know, he whispered. I didn't know it was you. The woman's voice was gentle. You didn't know, my son. But you let anger blind you. Why do you hate the poor so much? Richard lifted his head, his eyes red and swollen. Because I was poor, he admitted bitterly. I was taken to the city as a servant. I was beaten, starved, and treated like an animal. I swore I would never be poor again, and I worked until I became successful. I thought poverty was a curse. The woman nodded slowly. I understand your pain, Richard. But poverty is not a curse. It is just a phase of life for some. Wealth does not make you better than others. A person's heart and actions are what truly matter. Richard flinched at her words. He remembered how he had treated her, his own mother. Shame washed over him like a flood. Mother, he said, the word sounding foreign on his tongue. I don't know how to make this right. The old woman reached out and placed her wrinkled hand over his. You've made mistakes, Richard, but you can change. You can start by being kind. Life has given you blessings, use them to help others, not to push them down. Richard stared at her hand over his, a tear rolling down his cheek. Can you forgive me? The woman smiled softly. I already have. You are my son, and a mother's love knows no bounds. Richard broke down then, sobbing like a child. All the walls he had built around himself came crumbling down. For the first time in years, he felt free. The next morning, Richard's life began to change. He brought his mother to his mansion and gave her a room of her own. The servants were shocked to see their boss showing such affection to an elderly woman, but Richard didn't care. For the first time, he had his family back. He sat beside her every evening, listening to her stories of the past. He asked about his father, his village, and his childhood things he had buried for so long. One afternoon, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Richard turned to his mother. I want to do something, he said firmly. What is that? She asked. I want to help the poor. I've spent my life looking down on those who struggle, but I was one of them once. I can't undo the mistakes I've made, but I can use what I have to make life better for others. The old woman smiled, pride shining in her eyes. That is the man I raised. Richard got to work immediately. He started by going back to the very street where he had humiliated his mother. He set up a charity foundation to help the homeless and poor, providing food, shelter, and opportunities to rebuild their lives. The news spread like wildfire. People were shocked to see the once arrogant billionaire walking through the streets, speaking kindly to beggars and helping them with his own hands. One day, as he handed a loaf of bread to an elderly man, the man asked, "Why are you doing this, sir?" Richard smiled and replied, "Because everyone deserves kindness." The media picked up his story, and soon, Richard became a symbol of change. People admired his transformation, and his foundation grew, helping thousands of families across the city. Months later, Richard stood beside his mother at an event held by his foundation. The hall was packed with people, wealthy donors, struggling families, and those whose lives had been touched by his work. As Richard took the microphone, the room fell silent. "Many of you know me as a successful businessman," he began. "But what you don't know is the truth of my past. I was once poor. I was once hungry. And I spent years building walls around my heart, thinking wealth would make me better than others." He paused, his voice shaking slightly. "But I was wrong. The greatest wealth we can have is love, kindness, and compassion for those around us." The crowd applauded, some people wiping tears from their eyes. Richard turned to his mother, who sat proudly in the front row. "And to my mother," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "thank you for never giving up on me. You are the reason I stand here today." The old woman smiled, tears of joy rolling down her cheeks. For her, this moment was everything she had prayed for. As the applause filled the room, Richard felt a peace he had never known before. He had been given a second chance not just to make things right with his mother, but to make a difference in the world. From that day on, Richard continued his mission of helping others. He learned that wealth was not measured by the size of your bank account, but by the impact you make on the lives of those around you. And as for his mother, she lived the rest of her days in happiness, surrounded by the love of the son she had never stopped searching for. The story of Richard, the rich man who mocked a beggar only to discover she was his mother, became a lesson passed down through generations. It taught people that pride can blind you, but love and humility can save you. And so, the tale reminds us all, never look down on anyone, because life has a way of turning tables when you least expect it.